Very good. So hello, everybody. Thank you for coming today to the AIAA Los Angeles section Saturday town hall meeting. So we have a very distinguished speaker today. But before that, there's some logistic to tell you. We have a couple people online. They can participate. And number two, the restroom is right outside. Please welcome with hand to them. One of them, Marcel, is from Texas, and Dr. Greek is I think is with the company. So the Arrow is in Irvine. You want to come here, but can't make it. So the restroom outside. If you want to go to the restroom, you have to wave hands to the librarian. Otherwise, the door is locked. So the morning we have two talks today. The morning session is based on the bestseller book by the author. The afternoon one is debut is a new talk. So it's very exciting. There are more people join us. In between, there's like roughly 1 hour lunch break. And unfortunately, right now we don't prepare the food for you. But there's several restaurants, Subway, cafe, in the smoothie places, and McDonald's are nearby. So utilize. Atita?
It's a favorite part in this parking lot right in front, right?
Front. On the back.
Like this direction.
Yeah. As you see the center, yes, I'm about to say the parking.
But I think it's fine.
Yeah, the event is okay. If it's out with the event, that's okay. Yeah, that's right. And then we thank the library, Norwalk Regional Library, for support us, but they don't sponsor this event because whatever the speaker or the other will say is nothing to do with them. But they do provide this wonderful facility for us. Really highly appreciate. So one thing you do, the parking, the event should finish around 3, the networking, but the library parking will close around, I think it's 5:30 or 6 when they close. So early this year we have even some attendee park there over 6 p.m. It's difficult to get in to get the car back. You have to wait until we reopen next week. So keep in mind. Other than that, I think that we have a very wonderful display, as you can see here. And welcome to network in between and take a look. We do, as you can see, it's being recorded, and some of the faces here, just be aware of this. And just after today's event, the next AIAA meeting, the major one is the October 17th presentation next to LAX. Is by Dr. Jeff Pushell. Probably know Jeff. And Dr. Pushell, and is going to talk about satellite remote sensing for hyperspectral coast water imaging. And on November 2nd, we have Dr. Henry Garrett. He's like our Van Allen awardee, AIAA fellow. He's talk about space radiation and spacecraft interaction with other atmosphere. November 9th, we have event in Hawthorne. Hawthorne Library is a speaker talking about artificial intelligence and the design of spacecraft. Yes, AI, but not to the extent to replace us. And December 7, there was a speaker talking about re-entry spacecraft energy. That's related to ESA, European Space Agency award, by a speaker from USC. Is related to space sustainability. Okay. So our district.
If anyone would like to join us after the last talk, we're going to go down to Northwoods.
Oh, okay. Yeah. After the event today, everybody is welcome to join speaker, and Sherry joined us to a nearby restaurant in Norwood to further networking. It's a very good cozy place for dinner and networking. Yeah.
Is the kind of place where they give you peanuts and you throw the shells on the floor.
That's good. We need more peanuts. That's too sure. Yeah, everybody welcome. Online folks too, if you would like to come here. Okay, so today our distinguished speaker is Miss Michelle Evans. I think she is very famous and everybody knew. I just, without Michelle. And she has been supporting LFA for long, long years. If I remember, we have events in Century Boulevard and the Manhattan Beach Library and the Proverb. She is very supportive for LFA and the LA section. And she is the AIAA distinguished speaker. So actually everybody in AIAA, different section, student branch I would invite her. That's how AIAA works. And she, of course, you can see she's the best, also the best speaker, best seller for X-15 rocket plane flying the first wing into space. It's published by the Nebraska Press. I don't want to take too much time away from the presentation because we are a little bit delayed, but the key takeaway is the bestseller books. And she have a couple here. Please take a look here and can ask for the book signing. And another key information that actually Michelle has been working in the aerospace industries from Air Force and the private industry for airlines and spacecraft. But X-15 remained the passion for Michelle. I think she will tell you a lot, especially in the afternoon. She actually did a very thorough investigation, interview, all kinds of things, including story about all the test pilot, Neil Armstrong. There's a very amazing story you probably don't see from the books. And she is also behind the movie, The First Man, and also the real right stuff on National Geography. She's really amazing and got multiple awards. And is also among 100 most influential people in this area. She appeared on TV and Smithsonian Museum. So without further ado, let's welcome Ms. Michelle Evans.
Thank you much, Ken. I appreciate you having me here today. Well, need to turn the lights off. Yeah. And just to warn everybody, there's a lot of cords up here. So if you come up in front, be sure to watch your steps. And we have two different display areas. One in the back is the general X-15 display. And then the one up here in front is more geared toward the one that we're going to be doing this afternoon, more personal display. So thank you all for being here today. And I hope you'll stay with us for both talks. And I'll be here to answer questions, sign books if anybody's interested, things like that. So with that, we got somebody else coming in.
Michelle, check your mic. I don't think we're receiving it. There we go.
It's on. Yeah, it's on.
Yes.
Yeah, this is mainly for the people online. It makes it a little more difficult because I've got to operate everything and I've got to hold this too. So, yeah. Okay. So I'm here to tell you the story of the most amazing experimental rocket plane that ever took to the skies. But more importantly, I want to introduce you to the people who made it all happen. This is the X-15 rocket plane and the men who flew the first wings into space. Let me start with a short excerpt from my book. Eons of hot, dry sun baked the ancient lake bottom to near asphalt hardness, the color bleached to a dirty white. Close up, the surface was crisscrossed with fissures, giving it the look of dragon scales. Seasonal rain repeatedly scoured the top layer smooth. Roughly circular, the dry lake was more than 5 miles across, a perfect oasis of level ground among the scattered hills surrounding the area. Southeast of the silver boomtown from the early 1900s of Tonopah, Nevada, the lake was given the inauspicious name of Mud. No vegetation marred the pristine surface. Maybe an occasional lizard, snake, jackrabbit, or coyote might dart across the outer edges, but there was little reason for any living thing to trek across the vastness of that silent interior. All these inhospitable qualities were perfect for one special purpose. On the morning of 9 November 1962, that purpose was fulfilled as the quiet was shattered by a sonic boom. The X-15 with pilot Jack McKay at the controls had not achieved full thrust after launch, so he needed a place to land. Mud Dry Lake was directly to the east of his flight track. He turned and made for the ground. As he neared touchdown, McKay set the flaps, but they did not respond. His landing was going to be very fast. The rear skids slapped down, followed quickly by the nose gear. Bouncing slightly, the left rear skid failed under the strain. This started a chain reaction as the now crippled aircraft went out of control. The left wing and rear stabilizer scraped along the ground, ripping the stabilizer from its mount. The wing continued to slide, pivoting the aircraft, then flipping the X-15 onto its back. As the accident unfolded for McKay, time slowed as adrenaline kicked in, heightening his test pilot reflexes. Jack sensed the beginning of the flip, instinctively reaching for the canopy jettison switch. He knew if the aircraft went over, he would be trapped inside if it remained in place. The aircraft came to rest on its back as McKay had feared, but with the canopy now gone, the weight of the aircraft transferred directly to Jack's helmet, compressing his neck. A helicopter moved in using its downwash to keep the area clear of fumes from the toxic fuels aboard the stricken rocket plane. Now, it took 9 years to achieve Mach 1, Mach 2, and Mach 3. The last of these cost the life of pilot Mel Abt. Gaining speed was a dangerous business. Yet a winged rocket ship, which could double those records in a few short years, went into development, the X-15 rocket plane. Now, Scott Crossfield left the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics to work for North American Aviation to help design, build, and fly the X-15. Scott is seen here with the chief pilots for the NACA and U.S. Air Force, Joe Walker and Ivan Kinchlow. Unfortunately, Ivan Kinchlow did not live long enough to fly the X-15. He died just a few months before the rollout of the X-15 in an F-104 crash. Now, construction at the North American facility near Los Angeles International Airport was kept from prying eyes. I love this. It's like this is at North American, but they actually built a fence in the hangar where they're putting this thing together. So if you didn't have a need to know, you didn't get to see what this thing looked like until 15 October 1958, just 2 weeks after NASA was formed. The X-15 was totally open to the public and unveiled to everyone. Vice President Nixon that day said, "The X-15 is exciting because of the fact that it is designed to carry man into space for the first time. It's an integral part of an orderly and reasoned space program. These pilots are meant to be envied, for theirs will be the ultimate goal toward which men's dreams have stretched for centuries. It is useless for me to cite their bravery. We can only envy them for the opportunity which is theirs." Now, an integral part of the X-15 was the MC-2 pressure suit, seen here modeled by Scott Crossfield in a heat facility to make sure that the suit would keep him cool on his flights. It came from the David Clark Company that had previously specialized in women's undergarments. Crossfield once wrote, "The structural loads imposed on a girdle, as we all know, can be tremendous, and a machine which can build a good one automatically is an amazing engineering accomplishment." With his ingenious machine, Clark had all but cornered the important and, shall we say, expanding girdle market. Braving new frontiers, Clark moved into the manufacture of brassieres, which, considering those structural loads, was even more awesome. This then gave the David Clark Company the proper foundation on which to build America's first spacesuits, and they are doing that today as well. Now, the cockpit was a very tight fit, as you can see here in this extreme fisheye view from over the shoulder of Scott Crossfield. And they prepared for months for the first flight, but problems kept the X-15 in the hangar or attached to the B-52 mothership, where it was repeatedly fueled and checked out. On Monday, 8 June 1959, the X-15 finally achieved its first flight, dropping from the B-52's wing at 8:38 a.m. Scotty expertly glided the unpowered X-15 towards the Rogers Dry Lake bed at Edwards Air Force Base in California's Mojave Desert. As he neared landing, Scotty experienced a near disastrous pilot-induced oscillation. but he was able to expertly touch down at the bottom of one of those oscillations, and the first flight was a success. Scotty had microphones in his face before he could even leave the cockpit. At the time, everyone thought the X-15 would be the first vehicle to put a man into space. The second X-15 soon joined the fleet, making the first powered flight on 17 September of 1959. Rocket engine development, however, was behind schedule, so the XLR-11 rockets were installed, which were the same that had powered Chuck Yeager in the X-1 to the very first supersonic flight back in 1947. The LR-11s worked perfectly and touched down from the first powered flight. Second flight went fine, but the third flight did not go quite so well, as you can see here. A fire in the engine compartment and an overweight landing broke the back of X-15 number 2. But the number 1 was there to continue flight testing, while number 2 was sent back to North American for repairs. While the initial flight test continued, the third X-15 was being prepared for the 60,000-pound thrust XLR-99 rocket engine, the engine that was made for the X-15. Now, the propulsion system test facility, they could test fire 2 X-15s, but what I want to show here, you've got the 2 X-15s with the blockhouse in the middle, but look way up in the upper left-hand corner, you'll see a little red and white Bonanza. That was owned by Scott Crossfield. Scott's daughter Sally told me in the X-15 days, he started flying his Bonanza to and from Edwards because we'd moved from Lancaster down to Los Angeles because it was the only way he could get any home time by flying that aircraft. The powers that be at North American, however, did not like him flying his personal airplane because that was too dangerous. It's a bit ironic for somebody flying a Mach 6 rocket plane. Now, this is what a successful LR-99 engine and firing should look like in the test stand. But on 8 June 1960, it did not go quite as planned. A valve stuck, causing a fuel explosion, literally blowing the X-15 in half. Scotty in the forward section of the X-15 shot forward 25 feet. He actually experienced over 100 instantaneous Gs, but he did not suffer any major injury. Also, at least not that he told anybody at the time, because then flight surgeons would take him off. We won't get into that right now. But after being hosed down by the firemen, Scotty famously said the headline that day should read, "Aircraft blows up, pilot wets pants." Now, here's one of the only photos showing the first 4 pilots. You have Forrest Peterson from the U.S. Navy, followed by Scott Crossfield, who was the contractor pilot from North American Aviation, Bob White from the U.S. Air Force, who took over as prime pilot on the X-15 for the Air Force after the loss of Ivan Kinchlow in that terrible F-104 crash, and finally Joe Walker from NASA. Now, Forrest Peterson of the U.S. Navy was often left out, as you can see in this little publicity photograph. And we'll talk more about that a little later. Now, finally, Scotty had to leave. Here, Bob White symbolically takes the keys from Scotty, while Neil Armstrong of NASA looks on. They were anxious to get going. At one point, Scotty had actually made the proposal that he knew this aircraft better than anybody, so he should be the one to fly all the flights. Well, the Air Force was paying for it. NASA was running it. So no, please give us the keys. We're going to move on now. Here's a typical mission profile for an X-15. The X-15 was the very first experimental aircraft to leave the local area of Edwards Air Force Base. It required a 400-mile-long corridor known as the High Range, with 2 tracking stations that followed every flight besides that at Edwards, from Beatty, Nevada, just east of Death Valley, up to Ely near the northeastern corner of Nevada, 9,300 feet up in the mountains, where, as you can see by this photo, it can get a little cold at times. I went up there myself in June and was still turned back by snow. Now here's a group shot of the first batch of X-15 pilots, the primary and the backup. You've got bookend with Bob White on one side, who's the primary Air Force pilot, with Bob Rushworth On the nose section of the X-15 is his backup. Then you've got Jack McKay, who's the backup to Joe Walker from NASA, along with the second backup, Neil Armstrong, and in the center, Forrest Peterson, who was the one and only X-15 pilot from the Navy. Now, first up after Scotty was Joe Walker from NASA. He was a relaxed old country boy from the backwoods of Pennsylvania. And here he is stepping out of the shooting van and heading for the X-15 and dropping away on the first NASA flight on 25 March of 1960. Notice that NASA wasted no time in emblazoning their bright yellow logo on the rocket plane's tail. They wanted the world to know who was in charge of this plane. And compare the post-recovery requirements of an X-15 seen here. Now, this is actually fairly early in the program, so there's more people and vehicles than normally would be had. But at the same time, you have to remember we were flying Mercury, Gemini, Apollo heading toward the moon, which required an entire naval flotilla to recover one of those spacecraft when they came back. Now, Walker took the X-15 to the heights. On 22 August 1963, Walker topped out the X-15 program at 354,200 feet. That's 67.1 miles, or about 10 times the height of your average commercial airline flight. With no air, attitude control jets, as seen in this image, were required to keep the rocket plane properly oriented before a human-controlled reentry. And here's the curvature of the Earth as seen by the pilots of the X-15. Joe's eloquent perspective on this flight, he said, "The overhead aspect is just like one of these dark velvet photographer's cloths as far as the sky's appearance, but there weren't any specks of light shining through that I could pick out." He remarked, "My gosh, it's dark up here today. Quite a different view. What a beautiful day this is." Now, it can probably be said that out of the 12 X-15 pilots, Joe seemed to enjoy the ride more than anyone else. He said, "You know, you've got a long time to where you find yourself having done your looking around and figuring, well, if I'd had better sense, I would have looked more." Joe completed his stint on the X-15 and left to become NASA's chief pilot on the XB-70A bomber. On 8 June of 1966, Walker was flying an F-104 as part of a 5-aircraft formation centered on the giant B-70. His F-104, which is seen here below the B-70 with the orange tail, slid in tight for photographs and was caught in the wingtip vortex of the B-70 and flipped over the top of the giant aircraft. A frantic call of "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday" went out over the air. Walker was killed instantly as the F-104 rolled across the top of the bomber. The B-70 was also crippled and went down minutes later, killing co-pilot Carl Cross. But B-70 pilot Al White, who had been Crossfield's backup on the X-15, although he never got to fly the aircraft, did survive, but he had very severe injuries. Now, the prime pilot for the Air Force was Bob White, seen here with Joe Walker while he was still flying the program. These two guys were the primary record setters for the X-15. Here you can see White prepares for the drop and a very short 10-minute rocket flight to come. That's all it was. Once you were off the wing of the B-52, you were going to be on the ground somewhere in about 10 minutes. In this case, you can see the pilot's helmet there. Bob looks like he's got his head down. He's checking his switch positions before the drop occurs. Now, Bob White was the only man to be the first person to surpass 3 Mach numbers. Everybody knows Chuck Yeager, Mach 1. Scott Crossfield is the first to Mach 2. Mel Abt, who lost his life, was the first to Mach 3. Then we've got Bob White in the X-15, who was the first Mach 4, Mach 5, and Mach 6. And yet few people know his name today. Bob told me, "You know, I didn't realize until afterward that I was the first Mach 4, 5, and 6. Now, if some NASA guy had come up and said, 'Hey, wait a minute, we want Joe Walker to break one of these records here too,' I'm not quite sure what would have happened." The Air Force really loved to set records. Now, White was so proud of his skills as an X-15 pilot, so much so that he bet a martini to a buddy of his on the program that he could set that rocket plane down within just 1,000 feet of the planned touchdown point. And that's not bad when you consider he's gliding back from suborbital space using 1950s analog technology. And yet he won his bet on nearly every one of his 16 missions. And after becoming the first pilot to exceed 300,000 feet on 17 July 1962, White had to get out quick, get cleaned up, and catch a flight to head back to Washington, D.C., where he was to receive the prestigious Collier Trophy with fellow pilots Crossfield, Walker, and Peterson. President John F. Kennedy that day said, "We're very proud of these 4 young men who are among the finest we have, who took a manned aircraft into space yesterday to over 300,000 feet and more than 4,000 miles per hour. We're very proud to have them here, not only for what they've done in space, but also because they represent the kind of Americans whom we want this country to be identified with. We hope that their example will encourage others to do something that requires reaching beyond what we now know and what we now do." Now here's a comparison of the LR-11 and LR-99 rocket engines. It took 2 of the 4-chambered LR-11s on the left to achieve 16,000 pounds of thrust, whereas the single-chamber LR-99 on the right punched in was 60,000 pounds of thrust. It was just 6 feet long with that single chamber. It was also the very first rocket engine which could be throttled from 30% up to 100%. Now here's the twin LR-11s firing in the test stand as configured for the X-15, and the X-15 under power with the twin LR-11s. Maximum speed achieved was Mach 3.5. That's pretty good, except you have to understand that was only half of what was envisioned for the X-15 using the LR-99. Now here's a very impressive single-chamber LR-99 firing in the test stand and installed in the X-15, ready for flight. Now let me talk a little bit more about Forrest Peterson. Now he was the only U.S. Navy X-15 pilot. And while serving on the X-15, he was up for promotion. But to get that promotion in the Navy required that he have at least a year of sea duty. That's hard to come by when you're assigned to a base in the California desert. But a way was found around this requirement by assigning him to a naval squadron just north of Edwards at the China Lake Naval Ordnance Test Station. However, as Peterson said, all they did was assign me to that squadron up at China Lake, yet I stayed at the same office at Edwards where I'd always been. And China Lake was just as landlocked as Rogers Lake, but that didn't matter. After a year, I accumulated my sea duty, and they promoted me to commander. And as you can see here, some nice guy at NASA decided to paint a little shield on the side of the aircraft to commemorate that day. And I wish that there was a better photograph of it. The only photo of this is just so terrible that I can't even use it in here, but it shows Peterson coming out of the suiting van. They actually rolled out a red carpet for him between the suiting van and the X-15 stairs. And you could just see his face. It's like, why are you doing this to me? There's actually a ex-Navy bosun's mate who was there and tweeted him aboard as well. So he was like, just let me get on with the flight. Now, on 10 January 1962, Peterson made his last flight on the X-15 program, which also turned out to be the first emergency landing outside of Edwards. After landing safely at Mud Lake near Tonopah, Nevada, the X-15 then had to be trucked overland back to Edwards. It's about 200 miles through some very pretty backcountry in the desert. And that's a long trip, which also requires a stop for gas and a snack, as you can see here. And I always love this photo because notice most of the people, of course, are staring at the X-15, but you'll see several families up in front. They're all pointing outward. So daddy's out there taking their pictures. And it's one of my goals in life. One of these days, I want to find one of those pictures. I'm trying to find people in Beatty that might be able to help me with that. Now, Peterson had to leave the X-15 in order to resume his naval career, which included eventually commanding the aircraft carrier, the USS Enterprise. Guess you could say he was the original Captain Kirk. Now, Jack McKay is seen here with his wife Shirley and first daughter Sherry. And I say first because eventually this family will have 8 children. It's like, I don't know what it is about these test pilots, but they all had these huge families. The McKays had 8, the Walkers had 6. Let's go out and have a flight, then we're gonna have a kid, we're gonna have another flight, we're gonna have another kid. Just amazing what these guys were doing, yes. Now, strapped to the mothership's wing, McKay heads for the launch altitude on the morning of 9 November of 1962. Things did not go so well, as I read to you in that excerpt at the beginning of this talk from the beginning of chapter 5. Here is the aftermath of what that accident at Mudd looked like. The shadow of the H-21 helicopter is seen hovering over the crippled and upside down X-15 number 2. McKay has already been dug out and is on his way to the hospital. Operations engineer Bill Albrecht told me Jack McKay saved his own life. As soon as he saw it was going to tumble over, he jettisoned the canopy. He was smart enough to think, if I go over and I'm not breathing air, by the time they get here to try to rescue me, I'll be dead. Now you can see the massive damage to the X-15. Who wouldn't expect this to be a total loss? It's amazing that McKay even survived. Bill Albrecht told me, my first view of it was from the window of the C-47 Goonie Bird, which took a bunch of us up to Mud Lake. When I saw that thing upside down, I said, that's the end of that airplane. But it's a steel airplane, and it's something else. It's tough stuff. You know, normally aircraft are made out of lightweight materials like aluminum. This was made out of a nickel alloy steel called Inconel X. It weighed a lot, but it definitely made it a very strong aircraft. And although severely injured, McKay returned to the program and accomplished 22 more X-15 research flights, although he did experience 2 more emergency landings before finally leaving the program in September of 1966. You can see he popped the canopy here again at Delamar Lake, but luckily the aircraft stayed upright. Now, McKay was a family man with 8 children, seen here with 2 of them up at Red Rock Canyon. In the end, the injuries shortened his life, and he died in 1975, 13 years later. Sherry told me most of the time when there's an accident with a test pilot, they're just killed outright. They aren't hanging around in the halls at Edwards as a reminder of what might happen to them. I think my father felt alienated from everyone and everything, and he was in a tremendous amount of pain. Now, Bob Rushworth was up next, and he became the most successful X-15 pilot of the 12, accomplishing 34 flights in less than 6 years. Paul Bickle, the head of the X-15 program, related to me what Bob White had said of Bob Rushworth. He came into my office, and he was all agitated, and he said, he's not motivated enough. We asked if he wanted to get on the X-15 program, and he said he had to think about it for a week. He even had to ask his wife. Can you imagine? John Perry, the engineer in charge of the X-15 flight simulator, related to me that it was not a good idea for Bob White to get on Paul Bickle's bad side. If we misjudged something, Bickle was not at all reluctant to let you know. So we used to say, if you mess up, you're going to end up in the Bickle barrel. Now, as you can see by this photo, the F-104 and X-15 are very similar in shape and size. The F-104 was the perfect way for X-15 pilots to practice their landings, something that Rushworth and all the pilots did hundreds of times during the program. And except for that one rollover accident in 1962, there were no other incidents upon landing because of all the practice they got on the 104. After the McKay accident in 1962, remember that mess that you saw in the earlier pictures? Well, about 18 months later, this is what that aircraft looked like. It was sent back to North American. It was extended by 29 inches. They put it all back together. The most noticeable thing you see here is the addition of 2 external tanks for the fuel and oxidizer. Now, normally the XLR-99 at full power runs for about 90 seconds. That's it. After that, it's just a glider. But with the external tanks, they could add another 60 seconds of burn time. They were actually trying to shoot for up to Mach 8. Pretty amazing what they were looking for. With those tanks in place, this updated version could really push the envelope of what the X-15 was capable of. And like the solid rocket boosters on the space shuttle, the tanks would be jettisoned around Mach 2. On Rushworth's final flight, it was the first that used those for full fuel tanks. But El Cheapo transducers, as flight planner Johnny Armstrong told me, misread the fuel flow and the tanks were erroneously jettisoned. Another emergency landing back to Mud Lake. And here we have some of the pilots toward the middle of the program. We've got Jack McKay, who's about to take over as prime X-15 pilot in NASA from Joe Walker, who's right at the end of his time there. And the backup for McKay is Milt Thompson there in the middle. And then on the Air Force side, Bob White left and Rushworth moved up to the prime slot for the Air Force with his pilot, backup pilot of Joe Engle. And I'm really proud that Joe is also the person who wrote the foreword for my book. And terrible thing back in July that we lost Joe Engle. He was the last of the X-15 pilots who passed away. He was 91 years old and he was just an amazing guy. So I'll dedicate my talk today to Joe. So thank you, Joe, for everything you did. Now, not shown in that photo, who was part of the program at the time, was Neil Armstrong from NASA, who became the 7th X-15 pilot. And I always love this photo. Does he look like he's, what, about maybe 12 years old or something? This is like Daddy Take Me to Work Day or something. He always looks so young, and it was such a horrible thing to lose him back in 2012. Here's Armstrong with a couple of X-15 engineers, John McTeague and Elmore Adkins. You can see the shape of the X-15 above their head. The nose wheel of the X-15 is right behind Neil's head there. It's getting ready to be pushed back up into the vehicle and getting ready for the launch. And here he is leaving the suiting van and heading out to the rocket plane and ready for drop. Roger Barnicky of the life support systems, in other words, the guy who handled the pressure suit, said, I watched them get ready for a flight and they'd come back and they just had the biggest grin on their faces. They were doing something they loved and it really showed how much they enjoyed the flying. That was their life. There wasn't one of them that didn't give me that impression. Of course, I had to ask them then, well, what if something screwed up in the airplane that was the pilot's fault? Well, then they were kind of quiet. But they didn't hide things. That was dangerous. And Neil, contrary to popular opinion, screwed up on several occasions, such as the flight where he skipped back up out of the atmosphere in the X-15, or almost crashing his F-104 when checking out a dry lake bed for an upcoming X-15 flight because he couldn't judge his altitude correctly. Paul Bickle described this scene to me. Neil realized what he'd done, so he firewalled the F-104, but while the engine was picking up speed, the ship kept getting lower and lower. He dragged one of the tip tanks off and dragged the ventral right off the tail, which also released the arrestor hook back there. It also tore out one of the hydraulic systems and the radio antenna, which left him without any radio, only emergency hydraulics and red lights flashing all over the place. And this is what the lake bed looked like as he was coming down. Now, if you know the F-104, the landing gear comes out from the center outward. Here they're measuring to see just how low he got to the ground. This is the gear that was being pushed back up into the fuselage of the 104 as Neil kept getting lower. Continuing, Bickle said he knew he had problems, but he didn't know what. So he figured he'd make a flaps-up landing at Nellis Air Force Base near Las Vegas. But this hook is hanging out the back. He snagged that arresting chain across the approach end of the runway at 220 knots. Just tore the chain right out of the runway. His airplane went down the runway, dragging all this junk, and blew the tires out. Nellis was tied up for 3 hours just getting the runway cleared off. Then Milt Thompson goes up in a two-place F-104B in order to bring Neil back to Edwards. He overshot the Nellis runway, blew his tires off, and tied the whole thing up again. The aerodrome officer at Nellis called me and said, "Paul, please don't send any more of your airplanes up here. We'll load all your guys into one of ours and bring them back to you." It was a disgraceful display all around. After that, Neil left for the astronaut office in Houston, and the rest, as we say, is history. Now, early in Joe Ingles' career, he got to serve as a docent during a visit from Vice President Hubert Humphrey. He told me, "I was the new guy on the program. And Bob Rushworth, he's my boss. He says, you're going to go down to the hangar and you're going to stand by the X-15. Just stand there. You won't have to say anything." Humphrey came up and he asked me a question. "Well, what have we here?" Scared the hell out of me because I didn't know how to talk to a guy like that. But Joe recovered quickly, replying to Humphrey, "It's the X-15, sir." The vice president thought a moment, then said, "Oh, yes. Now, how many squadrons of these do we have?" Ingo wasn't quite sure what to say since there's only 3 X-15s, but he replied, "Well, not very many, sir." Humphrey said, "Well, obviously we need more of these. I'll see to that when I get back to Washington." Ingo went on to fly 3 astronaut qualification flights in the X-15, seeing the Earth from more than 280,000 feet above the southwest, as seen here. In this photo down at the bottom center is Las Vegas, and up toward the upper left is Lake Mead. Beautiful view up there. And here's a dramatic reentry, what it might look like from suborbital space with the X-15. Now, throughout this program, you've seen several images of the X-15 that are not actual photographs. These were all created by a friend of mine from Gothenburg, Sweden, by a guy, his name is Tommy Eriksson. And he and I worked together for like 6 years to come up with the images. I wanted to show the X-15 in places where it could not be photographed. And Tommy did this amazing job. Dr. Tommy, yes, dear. He actually earned his PhD using the work he did for creating these images. So yeah, really cool stuff. Now, many others were excited about the X-15. Even as astronauts prepared to fly to the moon, Werner von Braun, the architect of Apollo, stopped by Edwards and wanted to know what it would be like to fly a winged craft into space. And how about Miss Edwards' 1962 Wanda Capps gets a lift from the X-15's wing. And the cast and crew from the TV show Star Trek beamed down to check out the real deal. Now, the X-15 is often considered a man's program, but it should never be forgotten that many women worked on it as well. They were called computers, and they took all the data and plotted it out for the engineers using calculators, paper, and pens. Without the women, the X-15 data meant nothing. Like Neil, Joe left for Houston and was initially assigned as the lunar module pilot for Apollo 17, the 6th moon landing. But he got bumped from Apollo because they canceled Apollos 18, 19, and 20, and NASA really wanted to put a geologist on the moon, so he lost his chance to fly to the moon and land, but he stuck with the program. And Joe finally flew 2 more missions into space, commanding the space shuttle, STS-2 in 1981 and STS-51I in 1985. And can anybody tell me what state he was born in? Any ideas? Okay. Joe is the only astronaut who earned his astronaut wings prior to going into orbit with his 3 X-15 qualification flights. As I say, an amazing guy. We'll talk a lot more about Joe in my program this afternoon. We did a lot of amazing things together. Now, Milt Thompson was a man torn between 2 flight test programs. He also got to be NASA's technical advisor on the very first movie ever filmed in outer space. Says filmed in space. You're going to believe Hollywood, right? They would never. Yeah. Now, Milt recalled being involved on the program as a technical advisor for 3 months. I think they were here on site probably a couple months, and after that, we went down and spent a month in Hollywood during the cutting process. Of course, I had to ask him, did he have any input on how to make the film better? Oh, yeah. A lot of stuff. It was so completely wrong on many things. They really didn't understand airplanes at all. The guy that wrote the script had apparently never been around an airplane, but it's still a fun play. I love the film, but that's beside the point. Charles Bronson was one of the stars as the X-15 pilot, seen here with the real pilot, Bob White, and Mary Tyler Moore in her very first big screen appearance, and showing us what all good people should be wearing their nice high heels out there on the lake bed next to research aircraft. Now, the hype did not end there. Here's a couple of scenes from the movie Battle in Outer Space, where those squadrons of X-15s that Hubert Humphrey ordered got put into service battling aliens. I love this. We got gantry launch, we got silo launch. They're silver with red racing stripes. They're so cool. And what X-15 would not be complete without a death ray in the nose? Now, people forget how popular the X-15 was at the time. It was used to advertise a company's participation in the high-flying program, as seen here. Or maybe just get your attention by calling your product the Kodak Instamatic X-15. And yes, there is a camera in that picture. And yes, I have one of those cameras too. And besides film and advertising, there were many books, even one written by initial pilot Scott Crossfield, a great book, but including here The Fictional Adventures of Mike Mars. I love this. There's 8 books in the series, and 2 of them were about the X-15. Mike Mars Flies the X-15 and Mike Mars South Pole Spaceman, where he saved the X-15 after flying it up into space over Antarctica. Pretty amazing stuff. I actually took that book with me to Antarctica a couple years ago. That was pretty neat. And here's a really cool X-15 runaround friction toy. And even as OCD as I am about the X-15 and love to collect lots of things, even I didn't buy this one. It went for $900 on eBay. In 2006, the post office issued 2 X-15 stamps, which were also holograms. Pretty cool stuff. And this is the cheap one, $4.05. The other one was $14.95. You didn't usually go out and buy a whole sheet of those. After 14 flights and a chance at Hollywood, Thompson finished on the X-15. He told me he was busy on those altitude flights. I really only got the chance to look out the window once, and that was on my last flight. I got up on top after I had everything fairly well settled, then I looked out the window. Gee, it was a really impressive view. You could see all the way from San Francisco to Baja, California. It was beautiful up there, but you just have a few seconds to take a look. Milt was also the first to fly the lifting body type, and he had to make the choice of one program or the other. Paul Bickle didn't want him enmeshed in 2 different programs at once. And contrary to what you might think, Milt left and went to the lifting body program over the X-15. Now, Pete Knight was about to become the fastest man alive. His program was the X-15A2 with the external fuel tanks that he inherited from Bob Rushworth when he left the program. Pete made 16 flights on the X-15. One of them is considered the most famous, while another one was one of the most dangerous. And the program built up speed, testing out the capability of those external tanks. And one primary purpose of those high-speed flights was to test a scramjet engine as seen here attached to the bottom tail of the X-15. After years of work, this engine never came to fruition and has only recently been tested using unmanned vehicles at hypersonic velocity. And before continuing with the A-2, on a routine flight in aircraft number 1, Pete launched and soon afterward all electrical power in the rocket plane died. No one knew where he was or even if he was still alive. Pete told me, I was a little over Mach 4 and the airplane was just wallowing around. I still had reaction jets, so I maintained some control. At one time, I was up over 70 degrees of bank angle and I looked down and saw Mono Lake. I told myself, you better enjoy that view because that's the last one you're going to see. My thoughts were that this is going to hurt regardless of what I did. If I bailed out, I was over Mach 4. That's the limit on the ejection seat. So I thought, well, I'll stay with it. I'll see what happens, see how long I can keep control. And once I lose it, well, I won't have a choice. I'll have to bail out. As the aircraft went over the top, I started an auxiliary power unit that gave me hydraulics to control the reentry. I didn't have any instruments, and there were no lights in the cockpit. As I entered the atmosphere, I turned around and pulled about 6 Gs to go back to mud. I didn't have any flaps. All I had was airspeed and altitude once I went subsonic. Now you have to understand, too, that there's this whole series of lake beds along the high range so they could make emergency landings wherever they needed to. And so the mission plan says if you have an emergency between like 0 and 15 seconds, you have to land here. And then from there on, land at the next lake bed and the next lake bed until you can make it all the way to Edwards. The electrical power went out right on the break point between 2 lake beds, Mud and Grapevine. Pete did not like Grapevine, so he turned around to go back to Mud. Everybody at NASA figured, well, if he's going to land, he's going to keep going ahead. He's going to land at Grapevine. Nobody figured he'd go back to Mud. Well, Knight landed safely there at Mud, but it took him over a half an hour before somebody decided maybe we should go check some other lake bed and found Pete just sitting there on the lake bed at Mud. Once they arrived, Pete was flown back to Edwards and the X-15 was made ready for yet another convoy back to base. Now made to protect the X-15A2 and its pilots at speed of up to Mach 8, they decided to put this ablator cover over the top of the vehicle to protect the actual Inconel X. This Martin ablator had the consistency of a pencil eraser, and as you can see here, it also had the same color. But this stuff was oxygen sensitive, meaning that oxygen could soak in. And if something struck that, like a mechanic just dropped a wrench or something, it could actually explode. Not to mention, as Knight explained very emphatically to me, it's pink. I'm not flying a pink airplane. So they put a white paint layer on top, and Pete was then felt it was safe to come back near the X-15 again. And here we have North American Aviation's 2 white beauties, the XB-70 bomber and the X-15A2 rocket plane, which had now been nicknamed the White Knight in honor of Pete Knight. It was 2:31 in the afternoon of 3 October 1967 when Pete dropped away from the B-52 with a fully loaded, ablative-covered X-15A2. He leveled off at 102,100 feet and made his speed run, topping out at Mach 6.70, 4,520 miles per hour. That's coast to coast if they could keep it up in just a half an hour. Unbeknownst to him, the aircraft, unfortunately, was in peril as shock waves from that scramjet on the bottom were burning through the X-15 skin right into the engine area, the one area you don't want it to go to. After landing, the damage was clear. They had almost lost this X-15. This aircraft would never fly again. Pete said if he'd known this would be the final flight of this aircraft, he would have tried to push to get Mach 7 out of it. If he had, he probably would not have come home. For surviving the high-speed flight, Knight was awarded the Harmon Trophy by President Lyndon Johnson. Now, Bill Dana was the last of the NASA pilots to come onto the program, and he found the best way to get used to flying at Mach 6 or 300,000 feet or so was to sit in the hangar and fly the Iron Bird, the X-15 simulator, usually sitting back drinking a cup of coffee and talking to his friends there. Inside the hangar, here's 3 X-15s on the side and lifting bodies, other experimental aircraft. Now, this is a far cry from the mundane scene seen in that same hangar today. This is what the aircraft looked like when I was a kid and used to go to Edwards. This is what got me excited about the X-15 and led to my lifelong passion for this program. And here we have an unexplained Band-Aid on Dana's nose the day prior to his first flight. When we spoke, he refused to tell me how he got that. Maybe he got into an altercation with the simulator. He never told. Now, by this time in the X-15 program, the X-15 carried experiments rather than being the experiment itself. This is one of my favorite images that Tommy did. This shows the X-15 as it has never been seen before, working in space with instruments deployed. Solar spectrum, missile launch signature detection, high altitude balloon deployment, or Bill's favorite, and I do say this a little sarcastically, collecting micrometeorite dust. He said, I remember there was this big meteor shower, and to get out here to Edwards for the early flight, I had to drive to work in the dark. I have never ever seen so many shooting stars in my life. There must have been 1,000 as I came in from Lancaster. And those were the micrometeorites they were sending me up to try and capture. I always thought what a classically dumb idea it was in the first place. Of course, I had to ask him, well, what are the possibility of capturing one through the X-15 cockpit window, say, rather than the experiment out there on the left wingtip pod? Bill stated hopefully, well, I don't suppose it would have hurt us. Bill survived his high altitude experiment flights. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said of the 12th and final X-15 pilot, Michael J. Adams from the United States Air Force. After being accepted as an astronaut in the Manned Orbiting Laboratory program, he saw the writing on the wall that they were never going to fly. So he asked for and got a transfer to the X-15, where he flew 6 successful missions until the morning of 15 November 1967, less than 6 weeks after that high-speed flight of Pete Knight. Launching at 10:30 a.m., Mike headed upward into space, topping out at 266,000 feet, earning him a set of astronaut wings. But electrical problems distracted him. At the top of his arc, he misread an instrument and actually turned the X-15 backwards along its flight path for re-entry. As the air bit into the rocket plane, the orientation sent him into a hypersonic spin, knocking him out. No other aircraft before or since has ever been in a hypersonic spin. Mike came to long enough to grab the controls, but the aircraft went into a severe up and down porpoising motion, which exceeded the structural limits of the X-15, breaking the aircraft apart. Near Ridgecrest, the remains of X-15 number 3 crashed into the desert at 10:35 a.m., just 5 minutes after he'd left the B-52. Robert White said to me, I often felt that sometimes we went too far with these things. When I was participating in the program, your eye was always on the ball. It was very intense. Now you're starting to take this as a routine thing. Boy, this is not routine stuff. That NASA is a different NASA than the one I operated with. A memorial created by Eagle Scout John Podolsky now marks the spot in the desert where Mike Adams lost his life. And it has been greatly expanded over the years. It's amazing to see the people that go out there in the middle of the desert to see this. We've had people from all over the world who have signed in on our guest log out there. After the accident, the X-15 was flown by Knight and Dana 8 more times over the coming year before coming to a close with the final flight on 24 October of 1968. With a total of 199 flights, the hope was to have made it to a nice even 200 before the end of that year. The last of 8 attempts was made on 20 December. With all systems operational, Pete Knight was near the X-15, ready to board for the B-52 takeoff roll. The clouds opened up with a freak snowstorm in the Mojave Desert, and Paul Bickle came on the radio and said, "We're aborting the flight. Somebody is trying to tell us something." The X-15 program was officially completed. The number 1 X-15 was shipped off to the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., and number 2 went to the U.S. Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. Here, 7 of the pilots celebrate the X-15 at the Smithsonian soon after it arrived. The X-15 created 8 new astronauts out of the 12 pilots who flew it. 5 from the Air Force and 3 from NASA. The Air Force took care of their own at the time the flights happened, but it took until 2005 for NASA to recognize the achievements of Walker, McKay, and Dana. And Bill Dana was the only one still alive to receive his wings that day. What could have come next? A possible Delta wing variant, but that disappeared after the Adams accident, since the number 3 was slated for that program. Or a scramjet powered model, the true follow-on to the X-15, something which has never materialized in the over half a century since the program was completed. No manned X-plane may ever again achieve what the X-15 accomplished. No more testing our limits, no new frontiers to achieve. I hope that maybe the story of the X-15 and the people who made it happen may instead inspire a new generation to take flight in a quest for the unknown. The pilots of the X-15 bid you farewell and a good day. And thank you all for being here today, and I hope you'll stick with us for this afternoon's program as well. I'll be glad to answer any questions you have about the X-15 or the people involved in the program. Thank you. And if anybody has any questions, there we go. Now we can be blinded. Yes.
I was wondering why it had skids on the back instead of wheels.
Oh, excellent question. Well, it was basically a weight savings thing, because you didn't have to put this giant landing gear and all the mechanism on there. The skids, they weren't even up inside of the fuselage. They actually were on the outside, and the whole mechanism was nestled in the skid itself so that it popped down. And it was just a simple wire that was pulled by the pilot up in the front that pulled that release, and they just popped down. And sort of the same thing with the nose wheel. It was just a simple mechanical thing to drop it. There was no mechanism for bringing it back up except for somebody pushing it back up when it was loaded on the B-52. So yeah, they saved a lot of weight on the X-15 that way. But it was also interesting because you see most aircraft will have the landing gear like at the center of gravity toward the center of the aircraft, but the skids were on the back of the aircraft. So when the thing comes down and hits at around 200 miles an hour and those skids hit, you don't just float. The moment it hits, it drops it down, just kaboom, right on the front gear. So they had a nice little shock absorber system in the front end for that. So, yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
In all your research for the book, have you been able to come across any of the structural designers of mainly the wing box, et cetera? In all your work, it's concentrated, it's very good, it's concentrated on pilot experiences. But have you been able to locate any of the North American structural designers on the bird?
Well, I spoke with many of the X-15 designers. Well, the primary design team in North America, and it was headed up by Harrison Storms. And he's one of the people that I did interview, but I also knew a lot of the mechanics. I knew the guy who was the head of the external tank program at North American, also the rocket shop guys up at NASA, and the people who just, maintained the aircraft. And that was one of the things that I'm really honored to be able to do in my book is I'm focusing on the pilots here in the program, but throughout the book, you not only meet the pilots, you meet the flight planners, you meet the managers, you meet the mechanics, the rocket shop guys, all these people have their stories in there. I interviewed more than 70 people for this book, and so many of them are now gone. And so, as I say, this is really an honor for me to be able to tell their story and to keep this going. The book has actually been out for more than 11 years now. And I'm truly amazed that we're still out here doing these talks and being able to talk to people about this. And I've got 3 different programs that I give now. I'll be giving my brand new 3rd program this afternoon, which I'm looking forward to seeing how people enjoy that one. And I have a special display over here that goes with that program as well. And so, again, in the book, I tell the story about the people who did the X-15. But in my other program this afternoon, I'm actually going to be telling you about my personal journey with regard to the X-15. So again, I hope that people stay around for that, because it's going to be an interesting afternoon. So yeah, a lot of the guys there you'll be able to meet them in there. Absolutely. Yes.
Actually, I have a question related to that. Are the I don't know if you know the answer. Were the structural designers and stress analysts, was that 2 separate roles, or was that consolidated role?
I think those would probably be 2. I can't really tell you for sure. I don't know for sure, but I believe the way that North American had it set up, that would probably be 2 different jobs.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
I just wanted to point out to everybody, make sure you go to the author's website. There's hundreds of photographs there that she can't obviously bring into a presentation. We'd be here till midnight, but she's got fascinating material and things that you're going to want to see and look and read in addition.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's one of the things in the book, there's only like room for 45 photographs. So I set up a website which will take you through, I literally have like 3,000 photos on there now too. Yes.
And that's a follow-on question too. NASA, I guess, I'll ask you, has been releasing a lot of their documentation, okay?
Yeah.
Have you been achieving any success in getting a hold of the North American documentation, any internal?
Well, I got a hold of quite a bit of that. I've been through my research and stuff. It's actually one of the really sad things in this is the fact that, like, doing my research, I started my research back in 1983. I did my first interview then. It took 30 years of research and interviews and everything else before the book got written and published. And I spent a lot of time at North American. One of the things that I did was I went in there one day and went through like all their photo files. Less than a year later, all of that stuff was in the trash. They destroyed the building. It's gone. All those photos are gone. So the only stuff that really exists is the stuff that I got out of there personally. And I have a very large archive of X-15 material that I've gotten from NASA Edwards, from the Air Force History Office, from North American itself, from personal stuff. I've got some of the photos and stuff you've seen in here are ones that were taken by people on the program. They're not part of any NASA archive or anything. I've been to the National Archives, many places all over the country to search out all this stuff. And in fact, I just recently found that the original blueprints for the X-15 from North American now reside at National Archives out in Riverside. So my research is sort of ongoing on this to locate as much of this as possible. And I want to make sure that all of this stuff goes to a proper home when I'm no longer around. So all my interviews, all my research material, all this stuff is going to go to probably the Flight Test Museum up at Edwards, which is where it properly belongs. But we'll have to wait and see exactly how that's going to happen because they haven't finished the museum yet. So I have to make sure there's a safe place for everything to go. So, any other questions? Yes.
You mentioned a lot of that, like information of those were thrown away. Was that for like classification reasons?
No, it was just for room. And as I say, in this specific case, like the photo archives, it was trashed because they tore the building down. And they just didn't have any place to do it. There used to, that was at the facility at near LAX where the X-15 was built when they tore that all down. The B-1 bomber was also done in the same building where the X-15 was. Then over in Downey is the space division. That's where the space shuttle was originally constructed, or pieces of it. Then the final assembly was done up at Palmdale. And they used to have an employee store right off the site at Downey. And we used to go by there all the time because Saturday was open to the general public. And it was really sad to see what they did with so much stuff, because we walked into the store on one day and they had set up a couple of big tables like this in the middle of the store, you know, where they were selling patches and books and stuff like this. But on these tables, there was literally piles of photographs. Now, again, this was the location where Apollo was built, where the space shuttle was built. These were like all of the engineering photos and everything else that they had used to build Apollo and to build the space shuttle. And they were just thrown out on the table, and anybody could just take them away, and whatever wasn't taken was thrown in the trash. It's like, have you not heard of the Smithsonian or the Air Force Museum or someplace like that? They literally just threw a lot of stuff out. It's terrible. I'm so glad I was able to save what I can, but it's just a small fraction of what's out there and what was lost.
To amplify that, we picked up a copy of the original copy of the North American Aircraft High Temperature Structural Design Manual in a garage sale in Palmdale.
A garage sale, wow. Yeah, it's amazing what shows up. It really is. People, some of the things, again, you'll see some of it in the program later this afternoon. But the guys that I talked to, I say you'll meet most of them in the program later. But it's like this guy, John McTeague. He took home one of the X-15 skids. It was just sitting in his garage. I'm sitting there, he's telling me about this. It's like, oh, let me run out to my garage and I'm just gonna haul this into my living room. And he's got the skid with him, you know, things like that. There was a guy, Johnny Armstrong, who was a flight planner. And I was talking about the scramjet that was used on the X-15A2 program. And it was a dummy scramjet. They didn't have an operational one. They just had the shape on there. And on the front of this spike, there was a little aerodynamic spike that came off to the side. And Johnny Armstrong was the guy who found where that thing had dropped in the desert, because it actually ejected itself, not a planned ejection. And he was able to calculate where it was in the desert. And he was telling me about, you know, what he had to do to go out in the desert and find this. And then he opens up his drawer and he pulls the spike out and just drops it on the table. Yeah, here's a spike here, you know. So it was amazing what these people had. And unfortunately, so much of that stuff is gone. You know, so I have no idea what happened to that spike when Johnny died. Bob Rushworth, one of the pilots, had a lot of stuff himself. And he told us he was worried about his family because they didn't seem to care about any of that stuff. And so, again, who knows where it all ended up. And the stuff needs to be in a place where everybody can see it, if at all possible. So that's my goal for myself. Is to
And
make sure-
Rushworth had the program.
Oh, yeah, he had the January 1970 Society of Experimental Test Pilots had their annual meeting. And for that meeting, the special guests that day were the Apollo 11 crew, which had just landed on the moon a few months before. And one of the people who just showed up because he was a friend of Neil's was a guy named Charles Lindbergh. And as far as Bob knew, he was the only person who did this. He had a copy of his program, and the front cover of it was signed by Charles Lindbergh and Neil Armstrong. Could you imagine what? I got a picture of it, but that's all I've got. I just hope his family didn't throw that out, but it's almost certainly gone. It's just terrible to think this stuff is there. So I love the fact that I'm able to keep the legacy alive as much as I can through this. That giant model of the X-15 over there was a model that was from NASA at the time of the X-15 program. After the program was over, somebody decided to donate that model to the California Museum of Science and Industry, now known as the California Science Center. And they actually destroyed it when they were trying to bring it in. It fell and broke into pieces. And eventually it was found in a locked room, and I was able to acquire it. A friend of mine worked at the museum and said, oh, we got to give this to Michelle. And so I put it together, and I'm able to bring it out here and show it to everybody. instead of just throwing it in the trash. So, and other things, the thrusters that are shown in the little glass case over there, those are pieces of X-15 number 3 that were found after the accident where Mike Adams lost his life. And the person who got those was a NASA rocket shop guy who found them literally in a trash can at NASA and pulled them out. And he held on to them for a long time. He actually tried to give them to the Smithsonian, and they refused to take them. And a friend of his was a good friend of mine who worked on the program. And so he said, well, I think you should give them to Michelle, because at least you'll get them out there. So we made the case, and now we have them on display for everybody to see. So, yeah. Anyway, any other questions?
I have a comment.
Yes?
Okay, many things are managed by people who are not aware of technical things, in other words, unfortunately. I bought one of the basic engineering books, basic science, from a company for $1. The librarians keeping the books, they were not aware of the value of the book. They just saw an old dated book and they thought it is trash. It is like gold piece. They were not aware. The second thing is that the X-15 was designed too optimistically, knowing the things, the uncertainties. It should be designed with a much higher factor of safety. It was too optimistic.
Well, they did design in quite a bit of leeway in the structure. The structure, like on the Mike Adams accident where it came apart in flight, it exceeded the structural limits that were made for that aircraft by like 20% before it finally failed. So it was a terrible situation what happened that day, but the X-15 was a very, very robust design. If anything, it was over-designed and overbuilt in order to accomplish what they needed to do. And it's one of the reasons why they felt they could try to push it up to Mach 8 if they had not had the problems with the Adams accident and also problems with the scramjet that had the burn through and stuff. They probably could have gotten it up to Mach 8, and yet the aircraft was originally only scheduled to go to maximum Mach 6. And it almost went to Mach 7 and came pretty close to that. But yeah, it was actually a very over-designed aircraft from everything that we know. And talking with the pilots, the people who built it, like Harrison Storms and stuff, yeah, they have nothing but praise for the aircraft on how well it was built and how much its structure handled these different kinds of stresses that it was put under.
Well, it failed, so it wasn't good enough.
Well, it failed at more than 20% past where it should have failed. So as I say, I differ on the fact that it was under-designed in that case. You know, it was put into a situation, it's like an aircraft that hits the ground. It's going to break apart. You know, you can't make an aircraft that's not going to break apart when it hits the ground.
As a matter of fact, to amplify and back up and support what you're saying, recently looked at, we had to go ahead and look at some work that they did. They actually designed to a gust criteria. Now, something with 60,000 pounds of thrust and a 30,000 frame, you wouldn't think, but it did follow a gust criteria. You think for a rocket plane, it did, but they followed it, or America did. And on top of that, we recently uncovered the fact that they did look at body flutter on such a thing. You know, you wouldn't think at hypersonic speeds that it would be subjective. It's mainly in the transition zone, but they did. They did. So it's a testament to the North American designers and stress analysts on that they actually did incorporate those local instabilities and flutter at these speeds.
Did you work at North America?
No, I work right now watching.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, these guys were really amazing what they were able to accomplish. I mean, they pushed the envelope. As I say, the X-15 was designed and built. The fastest anybody had flown was Mach 3, and that had killed somebody. And here they were designing something to fly twice that fast. They did a truly amazing job of putting that aircraft together and doing something that nobody had ever come close to doing before or since. They have exceeded the altitude of the X-15, but nobody's come close to exceeding the speeds the X-15 got. Mach 6.7, 4,500 miles an hour. The most that anybody goes nowadays is about Mach 3 to 3.5 on something like the Spaceship Two or the New Glenn rocket, you know. So an aircraft flying at those kind of speeds, nobody is anywhere close to that. The SR-71, which is the one thing that most people know about, it flew Mach 3, half of what the X-15 did. So nobody's come close to that. X-15 stands by itself even more than a half century after it stopped flying.
Walk on. The wheel. Did. The mic. For somebody.
I'm not sure I caught that. Did anybody catch that here? You're breaking up really badly on your audio, so I wasn't able to catch what you were asking.
I was able to decipher something a little bit. You're interested in the sealing around the mechanism doors, around the gear doors, et cetera, which of course is a common interest among us. So I think that's what they said. I couldn't get much more than that out of the transmission.
Okay, you were asking about the sealing around the gear doors? I'm sorry, what? Okay.
Nose gear doors and main gear doors, or the skid doors is what I'm.
Yeah, well, there are no doors. The skids were open to the airflow. So they were actually on the external part of the vehicle. So there was no doors there. And the nose gear door, they just had, I believe they used some asbestos around the edge to make sure that there was, back in the days when they were still using asbestos. And that was the sealing that they had there. There were actually times when smoke would come in from the gear up into the cockpit during reentry. And it was never anything that they were really worried about, but they actually did get smoke inside there during the high heating portions. But other than that, I don't really have a specific on the structure itself, other than that type of sealing on there. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I think we'll probably want to take a break so we can have some lunch and stuff. And we're going to start the second program in about an hour. So I hope everybody enjoyed the program and got their questions answered. And I'll be here to answer more questions. If anybody's interested in a book in the meantime, please feel free to come up as well. And thank you all again. And we'll start again in about an hour.
I got the